Hello, psychology students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Module 9 talking about perception. And we're going to talk about some weird things here called perceptual constancies, then also talk about some pseudo psychology here as well to kind of wrap up this unit. But perceptual constancies is this idea of perceiving shapes, sizes, lightness of objects as unchanging, even as the object or the image of the object on your retina seems to change. So we can have size constancies, meaning that objects appear big, that are close, objects that are small appear distant. And what happens when the object, approaches you? Well, there's some weird things that can happen. So when the object approaches, you might see it as appearing quite small, and then it kind of grows larger and larger and kind of morphs. So I'm going to use my little device here, and we've got our what looks like our monster here, gigantic monster. We're going to kind of size him out. We're going to measure him. If I compare that to what's in the front, I might have to move this to the side here. There we go. Um, because of all the stuff that's going in the background, we got a little linear perspective happening. It makes this guy in the front appear to be very small, but in reality, they're the same size. And the same thing could be happening with this photo that's been kind of photoshopped. You got what looks like the small guy here, but yet when we put him into the background, um, he appears to be normal size, but we know he's off into the distance. We've got our little poodles again with the background. It appears like the one in the way back appears to be bigger than the one in the front, but for all practical purposes, they're the same size. So it's kind of a fun illusion to kind of mess with people, I guess. But that's the point of the size constancy. We expect size to remain constant, and in some cases, we get kind of fooled by some of this. Anyway, our knowledge of the worlds would lead us to conclude that when the apparent size of an object changes, the actual size is not changing at all. Anyway, um, sometimes we can have this based on a misperception of size and distance cues. And thus, when somebody moves closer to you, you would have to stop and wonder whether the person is morphing into a giant before your eyes. Just kind of weird stuff there. But we also have shape constancies. So we have the door. We know that doors, for all practical purposes, are rectangular. But as this door opens in this picture, we don't really think about the door changing shape. I mean, but reality is it goes from a rectangle to more of a trapezoid. Uh, and yet, we know that when we open the door to our room or whatnot, um, we know that the door isn't really changing shape. But for the most part, that's part of the shape constancies. It's, again, trying to create that illusion that you have that movement and such. You have light constancies, you know, or lightness constancies. This gives the ability uh, for an object to have maybe a constant level of lightness no matter what the lighting conditions are and how they might change. So if we take a white piece of paper and we put it out in the sunlight, it might appear to be really white. And yet take that same piece of paper and put it in a dimly lit room, it appears to be a little more gray. And you can do that maybe with shading and highlighting to maybe create that illusion on a piece of paper or a piece of art, or maybe to even how we draw the lines to create a little more depth to that. And we'll talk more about that here in a bit. But we also have perceptual sets. These are mental dispositions about how we perceive something one way and maybe not another. If you remember the uh, image of the old lady and the young lady and how you kind of have to flip it. This is kind of like that. So the middle image here is really what you would typically see, but are you looking at the figure or are you looking at the ground? If you're looking at ground, you probably see, the woman. If you're looking at the figure, you might see the man with the saxophone and the little bird that looks like Twitter that's kind of flying towards him. So we can predispose the persons towards seeing maybe a saxophone or a woman's face, depending on how we want to do that. But truth is, this image here is very ambiguous, and how you perceive it might depend on, again, if you're focusing on the figure or the ground. And it might be because maybe you have, a desire to look at an instrument or maybe a desire to look at a person's face. Um, We do develop what we call perceptual sets guided by schemas. Schemas are like ways that we organize material in our mind. And one of the most famous and probably practical schemas that we develop, maybe even in infancy, is this idea of the schema for the face. And so we have these two photographs, kind of looks like a face, or if you look at the flag that's in my classroom, it looks like the unhappy face that's up there on the 76. We like the schemas for faces. It just is something that we are kind of drawn to. When we talk about illusions, you have optical illusions. We perceive things that could not exist, probably exist, or possibly exist. As an example of an impossible figure on an object that is not really there. Our brain likes to, again, try to figure out patterns and try to make things make sense. You can have visual illusions, those are graphically demonstrated. Again, that's visual cues. Sometimes we can be fooled by that. Physical illusions, this is kind of distorting information receiving our receptor cells. And this can be in the form of not just visual, but it can be auditory. It could be how we feel things, the illusion of something being hot or cold. And it might be like on a cold day going out and playing in the snow and then coming in and then putting warm water on your hands to kind of warm up, and how much that burns. That is somewhat of an illusion. You got perceptual illusions. Again, this is misleading cues in our stimuli that cause us to create these perceptions. And sometimes this is an issue when we talk about people who have schizophrenia and they're hearing things or seeing things that aren't exactly there as well. So, some different illusions that we can take a look at. We got the Mueller-Lyer illusion. When we look at this segment of lines, we got the AB segment, the BC segment. It might make some people think that the BC segment might be a little bit longer than the AB, but if I measure this out, here's AB, and then I move this line. BC is actually a shorter segment. But because of the way these arrows are moving either inward or outward, it creates an illusion that maybe this line might appear to be shorter than as these lines look like they're moving away, that appears to be longer. So it's kind of a cool way to kind of deceive us. But you can do the same thing, maybe even in a drawing. So I've got my segment here. Uh, we got our lines kind of moving away, kind of forming like what looks like the floor and a ceiling. And yet, if I move this further to this corner, this line appears to be a lot shorter than it does here. So, cool illusions in that regard. I don't know if you can use that in a day to day basis, but it might work if you were doing a set for maybe one act, or if you're trying to make a person who's short appear taller. You never know. Speaking of short appearing taller, we've got the Ames room, which is really kind of a fun illusion, because a lot of times you might see this maybe like in an old-fashioned fun house at an amusement park. So we've got our two people, they're the same people, but yet depending on where they're standing here or sitting, they appear to morph in size. And the key here is not so much the two people as it is the room itself, because the room is distorted. So I'm going to flip this and show you kind of what is happening here with the room. The floor is kind of been lifted a little bit. The ceiling has been dropped. So if this was a normal squared room, even the back wall has kind of been moved a little bit. And the goal here is to get people to look at this room maybe in only one dimension. So you only have one place. You're going to look at it front and center. So that you don't see what has happened here. So from all practical purposes, when you look at this, it kind of looks like the room is it's kind of typical in size. I mean, you look at the tiles and it kind of looks like it all matches up, but the ceiling has been raised or been dropped, and the floor has been raised in different places, and the wall has been moved and such, and thus you get this weird illusion that happens that can kind of distort our brain a little bit. Other illusions, this is going to probably look like some things that we talked about the other day. Do you see the circle, or is it really there? And it's the idea that, when we chop up these black lines here, we make this illusion that there's a circle here. And again, this is kind of a gestalt idea, this idea that our brain likes to do closure and close these gaps and make sense of the world that we're seeing, rather than seeing these broken lines that don't make any sense. When we talk about, again, the light constancies, we kind of saw this diagram here earlier, but the shadow and the light, you might notice the ripple, maybe here, or maybe even the dimple, and what might appear to be maybe something that is moving a little bit closer to you. All of that is trying to use light and shading and highlighting to make something appear to have a little more dimension. And a lot of times we do this maybe in art to kind of make something appear a little more dramatic. And not only are you doing this with like maybe graphic designs taking shapes, but it also is used, by artists who are doing oil paints, trying to make the human face and its flesh kind of look more human-like through the highlighting and shading. I want to talk about some parapsychology stuff here. And this is really in the definition of what we call pseudopsychology. It's basically a psychological phenomenon that really isn't there. You can't really test this with any kind of scientific methodology. And this is stuff that some people put a lot of emphasis on, but for the most part, it's really a false science by any means. But I do want to kind of label and explain some of this. If you've ever heard of ESP, that's usually known as extrasensorial perception, this idea that you can sense things that aren't there. Um, a lot of people have tried to prove this, and it's really kind of flopped every time. But you might hear people talking about, oh, I have ESP. Chances are they probably don't. There might be other cues that they're giving. Maybe a subject is giving to make it seem like somebody knows more than what they do. But you can have clairvoyance. Might have people talk about that, like they have an awareness of an unknown object. Sometimes illusionists or magicians that you might see in places like Las Vegas, they can say that they know something that's there. Chances are they've kind of planted some of that, and it kind of is exciting to listen to and watch, but there's probably a lot more choreography here that goes with that. That's probably already been predetermined. Telepathy, this idea that you can, somebody else's thoughts and feelings. Well, sometimes people kind of reveal that maybe through their body language and such. I don't know if you can really read people's minds necessarily, but you might get an idea of maybe how they're feeling just by how they're acting or speaking. Um, Precognition, this idea of knowledge of future events. Again, we probably don't have the ability to test that, but you can make guesses, I guess. And then there's these things called Zenner cards. Your book talks a little bit about this. It was like a test for clairvoyancy. Uh, they were trying to make it scientific, but truth is, these cards were kind of a joke. So, needless to say, that is all I have for you. Thank you very much.